Hello there, this is Candice Cherie, and this is the second episode of En Soma. So this is kicking off a series of episodes exploring the shadow side of spirituality and spiritual communities. And by spiritual communities and spirituality, I'm not necessarily talking about particular organized religions, because no doubt there's definitely a lot of shadow to be explored and to unpack. Rather, I am exploring a type of spirituality that I have been seeing lately in the collective, particularly this type of spirituality that emphasizes the individual, where the individual uses all sorts of perspectives, traditions, and tools to navigate their own internal reality. Now, some people may call that New Ageism. I think that there is a kernel of truth to labeling this type of spirituality New Ageism, but I think it goes beyond that label and that idea. I think what we're seeing now in spiritual communities, no matter what tradition it is that there is a growing dominance of the feminine principle, which emphasizes the individual path and this individual personal connection to other dimensions of consciousness and the divine. So that's the kind of spiritual community I'm talking about. That's the kind of spirituality I'm talking about. I'll be talking a lot about, for example, yoga communities, because I think that yoga is a very popular tool and tradition right now when it comes to contemporary spirituality. But what I'm trying to unpack is the shadow side to this. And by shadow, I'm really playing on an idea that originated with Carl Jung. And it's a really big theory. All of Carl Jung's ideas and theories are very difficult to pin down. They're like these massive oceans of perspective, and they're very fluid and moving and vast and abstract and somewhat intangible. I feel like whenever I try to grip onto one of Carl Jung's theories, it feels like sand in my hand. Like it's just really hard to grip onto it. And the shadow is like that. There's so many ways you can talk about the shadow. There's so many facets to this theory, but I'm going to do my best to kind of offer some sort of grounding and maybe just one facet of his theory or one perspective. And this perspective is deeply rooted in my own personal experience. So fundamentally, I think the shadow is the aspect or the parts of the psyche that are hidden from our conscious awareness. We both know that there is a light aspect of our consciousness, this aware thinking mind, but then there's also the dark unconscious aspects of ourselves that we do not know, we do not see, that are not within the light of our awareness. And there will always be things in the unconscious, of course. There's going to always be processes and operations and things happening that are a part of us, but we're not aware of. I feel like that's just kind of the reality of having a body. But one thing that does happen when it comes to the shadow is that as a byproduct of growing up, socializing, becoming part of a community, a culture, a family, a society, one's primal energy has to be curbed a bit. And in order to be liked and accepted, in order to survive growing up, things are banished to the shadow. Aspects of our personality, hidden treasure like talents and gifts and things like this, they can be banished to the shadowy parts of our psyche. And as we grow older, what can happen is that the shadow can wreak havoc on our lives. What happens to anything that you neglect and you put into the dark? It becomes monstrous. So, a lot of times when you're doing shadow work, what you are essentially doing is going into the shadowy parts of your psyche and confronting what's there. Some of them may seem like inner demons, but I mean, it would be, how could I say? It would be misguided to label them as inner demons or monsters. Rather, it's aspects of ourselves that have been so neglected over time that they turn demonic or monstrous, and they're acting out in the psyche in order to get our attention. A lot of these shadow entities of material, however you want to call it, a lot of these shadow aspects of our personality, a lot of times they just want to be brought to light. They just need some attention and some love. A big part of shadow work personally has been going into the dark places of myself and looking at the things that I for a long time maybe didn't want to see, and giving them a lot of love and compassion. Shadow work, while difficult, it is a huge act of self-love and compassion. The goal of shadow work, I would say, is to become more whole. Wholeness is a big topic within Jungian theory. The goal is not salvation or bliss or these kind of things. It's about wholeness. It's about allowing more of yourself to be. And it has done wonders for me. It's been absolutely healing, and I definitely feel more at home in myself and definitely more whole. So that's a bit about the shadow. I would love to unpack this more in a separate episode of what shadow is, what is shadow work, and how one can do it. And yeah, definitely. But let's go on to the topic, which is the shadow side of spirituality, because while individuals can have shadow, and having a shadow is kind of a necessary byproduct of growing up and socializing and developing, also cultures and families and collectives and societies and communities can have a shadow. For example, if you look at our current society and you ask yourself, like, what are some of the things that are deemed unacceptable? Well, there's a lot that you could unpack, but one thing I would say is this demonization of the irrational, of emotions, and the unknown. It's kind of unacceptable in our society, in our communities, to embody a certain type of chaos. We like order, we like logic, we like problem solving and solution, and therefore certain principles, particularly the feminine principle, has been demonized and deemed unacceptable, and it's been banished to the shadows of our collective and our spiritual communities. And I mean, that's just one thing. There's many things you talk about with our societies, I think the shadow side. But one of the things I want to do is talk about the shadow side of spirituality and bring up a few things that I see. And the goal of bringing it up is to basically ask if you guys see this too. Because one of the things that you have to do when it comes to shadow work is to bring the light of your consciousness to the shadow material. That's the way to heal it. So by bringing it to light, by talking about it, we could potentially heal this shadow aspect of our communities. And I'd be curious to know if you guys see the same thing too. I'm pretty sure with this topic that I'm about to unpack, we probably do see the same things, but I do want to offer a particular perspective on it that might be useful or not useful, I don't know. But it's just something I want to bring up. And so the first shadow aspect, or the first piece of shadow material that I want to focus on in this series, is what I would call the negative guru. And as a unique spin on this topic, I want to approach the negative guru like an archetype. And this is also a Jungian theory. And an archetype, there's a lot of, again, a lot of different ways you can look at the archetypes, but they're more or less fundamental impressions in our psyche that we've inherited throughout our evolution. They're ancient, primordial actually, and they're universal. So for example, the mother, the great father is an archetype. The king, the queen, those are archetypes. They're just different images that are somehow imprinted in our psyche, and it's part of our inheritance of being human. They're present in our stories, in our symbology, in our myths, in our fairy tales, etc. So I don't want to go too deep into the theory of archetypes, but one thing that I've come to understand is that an archetype can have a negative expression and a positive expression. How they express themselves and how they influence our psyche can exist on a spectrum between negative and positive. So you can have a positive mother archetype influencing your behavior and the way you think and the way you feel, and you could also have a negative mother. So when it comes to archetypes, they're usually expressed within us in a very layered way. At the core, you have a universal archetype, but the way that it's expressed within us will depend, for example, on our genetics, our society, our culture, our experiences, our family. So for example, the way that I experience the mother archetype is very personal to my own experiences, my own cultural heritage, my own familiar settings, etc. So when it comes to interacting with archetypes, there's both a individual and a collective component that one has to wrestle with. I've noticed that, for example, when working with archetypes, it's often futile to just focus on the universal image. You also have to confront what is happening within yourself, how the archetype is being expressed individually within you. For example, if you're trying to work with the mother archetype or the father archetype, you must first unpack, how is that archetype, what sort of constellations is the archetype expressing within your own psyche, and go from there. But yeah, anyway, this is all to talk a little bit about archetypes and to say that there is both a positive and a negative expression of archetypes. And if we look at the negative guru as an archetype, that there is a guru archetype within us, and it can present itself, express itself in all sorts of ways, then I think it can offer a very interesting dimension to this conversation, because it also shows us that, it's not only easy to fall victim to a negative guru, but it's also quite easy to become one. And I want to talk about both of those. But first, let's go ahead and talk about negative gurus and gurus in general. I know that we've probably heard a lot about these negative guru types in various headlines. We've heard many stories over the years of very exploitative and abusive guru figures, and I think often these stories show us the extremes of just how bad this type of guru, spiritual teacher, and disciple can get. But before diving in, let's talk about what a guru is. It's a term that it has been, in my opinion, cheapened and butchered by my culture, Americans in particular, where anyone who knows a little something about something is called a guru. We have these lifestyle gurus, sex gurus, marketing gurus. And I'd say in the West, we really use this term to mean anyone with just some subject matter expertise. But within the yoga tradition, a person's spiritual evolution was often occurring within a guru-disciple relationship. In Sanskrit, gu refers to darkness and ru means to dispel. So, although I really can't say too much about the connotations of this translation, to my understanding, it means the one who dispels darkness. And I think in this context, darkness can be roughly considered as ignorance. So, a guru is a coveted spiritual guide who helps individuals evolve spiritually and basically come to understand their true divine nature. And they do this by dispelling ignorance, dispelling the darkness, and all the things that cover our true self. If you want to learn more about gurus in this tradition, in the yoga tradition, I really recommend reading Autobiography of a Yogi. I didn't know much about this tradition of gurus until I read that text, and it's a really lovely read. But since I lean more towards Jungian philosophy, I actually see a somewhat similar but slightly different meaning in the idea of dispelling darkness. I see self-realization as a process of becoming more conscious and more aware of ourselves through shadow work and deep introspection. But of course, to each his own. It doesn't matter. So if we think of the guru as an archetype, and it has this positive and negative expression, which means that as a psychological image or symbol, we have both positive and negative gurus, like what you see in the Autobiography of a Yogi and all the beautiful stories of positive gurus like Mahavatar Babaji, Lahiri Mahasaya, and even Yogananda himself. And there are many people out there who've been very fortunate enough to find positive guru figures to help them in their journey. I know I have, and I'm very grateful for it. But then there's also the negative guru, and within all sorts of spiritual traditions and community, there are many false leaders, negative gurus, and just simply bad priests. So I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I would hypothesize that at the core of a negative guru is a deep mistrust in their disciples, and this attitude or this belief that they have the authority, the expertise, and the knowledge on what is best for other people. There's this kind of misguided confidence that they have the solutions to alleviate the suffering of others, and that they have all the answers for how a person should evolve. They carry a belief that they hold the key to your salvation, transformation, healing, wholeness. And there is a lack of recognition that the individual, the disciple, the student, actually holds all the power. And it creates this wonky power dynamic where the guru places themselves between the student and whatever spiritual attainment. So whether that's connection with the divine, transformation, healing, etc. And this is a really complicated subject because you can have a lot of teachers and spiritual leaders who may have this attitude towards their students, but may offer very valuable teachings, and they can be actually pretty good at facilitating healing and transformation for the people that they teach or the people that they guide. This is not such a black and white issue as, nothing is. And of course, there are definitely the more extreme cases. For example, I'm thinking of Bikram. I just recently watched that documentary on Netflix, where you have these figures or these spiritual teachers that, for one reason or another, they got so inflated and they even became predatorial. So again, it's hard to talk about this in a very simple way. It's all very complicated, but I think that at the core of the negative guru is this notion that I, as a teacher, hold the key to everything that you want and desire. And it creates this power dynamic where they hold all the authority, all the power, all the expertise, and all the knowledge. And I think that perhaps we're moving away from this type of dynamic where a lot of our spirituality is wrapped up in a relationship between like a spiritual middleman and the individual. Because I see that the feminine principle is growing dominant in our collective psyche. And what that means is that the individual is often finding their own inner guidance, their own inner guru, and they're having a more embodied connection with higher consciousness and the divine, and really paving and walking their own path and connecting with their power that way. So I see that the relevance of the spiritual middlemen are becoming less and less, in my opinion. But that doesn't mean that we still don't have these figures out there wreaking havoc on our spiritual communities. So one of the reasons I want to talk about this is because I find this topic quite triggering for me emotionally. Because I recently went through a kind of spiritual breakdown, particularly when I first started doing analysis work, when I first started looking into my shadow. And so I know how delicate this process can be. I know the desperation and the frustration that comes with feeling so spiritually disintegrated and broken apart that it's really easy in those moments to just want to outsource all of my power and my own authority to someone external, some teacher that I feel like I can trust. I know how delicate this work can be, and therefore I have zero tolerance for teachers or guides that do not recognize how delicate it is, and they take advantage of this either consciously or unconsciously. So it's emotionally triggering for me because I have zero tolerance for these types of figures. And I feel very, very, very fortunate because I had amazing people guiding me as I went through the most tumultuous parts of the spiritual process or the heroine's journey. Because I know that if I had been in the wrong hands, I could have been manipulated much more easily, because it was just a point where I just felt like I didn't know who I am. I didn't know what any of this is. And I felt like I really didn't have any personal power. And I was lucky enough to have guides that even in those times where I was just like begging for something or someone to take over because I felt quite helpless in myself, I kept having guides that were trying to connect me to my own inner personal integrity, that were always throwing it back to me and say, okay, what do you think you need to do? And oftentimes, not always, but most often, the solutions I came up with, or the things that I could do to help myself, were often way more powerful and way more empowering than any sort of advice or guidance that would come from someone externally. So let me break this down another way. So I come from a background of education, and in education, we often think of the way you teach someone can be thought of in two different categories. There's transmissive education, so education by transmission, and then there's transformative education. And to simplify this, basically transmissive education is this: you have a teacher, they have some sort of information or knowledge, and they're trying to transmit it or pass it on to the student. This is what you typically see in a classroom, where the teacher's up front offering some sort of lesson or lecture, and the student's job is just to absorb. It kind of has this idea that the teacher is the vessel of knowledge and the student is the empty vessel looking to receive that knowledge. Then you have transformative education, and transformative education is where the teacher sets the stage for the student to figure it out for themselves. I like to think of this as sandbox learning. So they provide the safe environment, the sandbox, for the student to figure it out for themselves. And I think that the spiritual process and spiritual teachers are more going towards a transformative direction where they hold space. I think that's a really great way of thinking about it. They hold space and they provide the necessary container and environment and setting for a student to connect with their own inner truth, with their own power, and to heal and transform. That's been what my guides are like. They do this. They're mostly like these transformative teachers. They kind of provide the space for me to figure it out on my own. And this type of teaching, this type of way of guiding students is very powerful because it helps students connect with their own sense of agency, and therefore it can be very empowering. And especially when it comes to the spiritual process, whenever a student finally owns their own journey, that can be a really great way for someone to connect with their own inner power. But let me be clear, there is a place for both types of education. There is a place for transmissive and there is a place for transformative. But as you can probably already assume with those descriptions, that many of our educational systems rely too much on transmission and not enough on transformation. So you have to balance between those. And of course, like when students first enter a tradition, they often will first go through a more transmissive process where they receive knowledge about the tradition. They receive knowledge and information and expertise about the different things they can do, the different tools. And it's often a process where the teacher acts as, the carrier of information. And the student's job is just to absorb that information. But almost every teacher that I've encountered in a certain tradition will say that at the beginning, especially if you're beginning and you're kind of dipping your toe into a tradition or a particular perspective or philosophy, that there will be kind of a learning curve, but then eventually a student has to own their place within that tradition. They kind of have to find themselves and adopt the practices for their life, etc. And that's a great mark of a teacher, is when they can help a student mold certain traditions to themselves. And they do so recognizing that eventually a student is going to have to find themselves within that tradition. So this is all to say that, it's not that you should completely reject teachers who offer lectures or are a bit more transmissive. No, that's not to say that. It all depends on their fundamental attitude. Are they there to empower you, or are they trying to take away what power you have and pretend that they're the ultimate authority? For example, I know that there are some people who really respond well to more militant and authoritative teachers and really kind of like getting their ass kicked in certain traditions. I think of, for example, Ashtanga yoga as one. They just really enjoy kind of absorbing what the teacher has to offer. And I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that. The thing that I want to emphasize, that I think is the point, that the shadow piece that's worth talking about, is if the dynamic grows sour, where the teacher assumes all the power, all the authority, and really robs the student of their agency. And it can really get quite sour. And it can get quite twisted, where a guru type figure, in order to, hang on to their authority and to cling to power, they start manipulating their students to do things that are not in their best interest. So, for example, I often hear these statements by teachers who I would say are quite negative. Like, if you don't do as I say, then you're still operating out of fear. Or if you do not do as I say, then you are still operating in comfortable ignorance. Or if you do not do as I say, then you are still operating from your ego. I hear this one a lot. If something doesn't feel right to me, it definitely has to be because, it's my ego that I'm still clinging to. Just somehow insinuating that you're just not spiritually ready or evolved to do whatever it is that they're asking you or proposing that you do. And those are very convenient arguments, aren't they? You really can't, prove them wrong. There's really nothing tangible that you can pull out to say that this isn't true. And because they've already established that they have knowledge and authority and that they know kind of what's best for others, it's really hard in a community, especially, to question that. But I think that these are definitely marks of a negative guru. I think, for example, if you were in a tradition and you had a good teacher and you came across a practice or something that made you feel uncomfortable for some reason, I don't think a positive teacher would make any assumptions about why you feel the way you do. It could be because you're just feeling too fearful. It could be coming from a place of ego. But I think a good teacher would try to help you unpack it and figure out why you feel the way you feel, and eventually help you come to some sort of conclusion that will feel very empowering to you. They wouldn't pressure you into doing something that you don't want to do. So this is a little bit about like what I think marks a negative guru. And to package this idea more neatly, a negative guru stands in the assumption that they are really the key, that they have your answer, that they are your cure and your solution. And it's all about them, really. They hold all the power. Whereas I think a positive guru recognizes that you, or we as individuals, hold our own answers, our own solutions, and our own cure. And they're just there to help facilitate and guide the process. And they help us connect to our own inner truth, our own power. And they also recognize that any healing or transformation that takes place is done by the individual. It may be facilitated by the community. The teacher may have guided it, but ultimately it was the individual who did the work. And this is also something that I really hope that students out there, if you're listening, understand this, that it's important at the end of whatever session you're in or whatever workshop or whatever sort of community setting you're in to, thank the teacher, but pat yourself on the back. Always bring the power back to you. And it's also really important for teachers to always let the student keep their own power and always point it back to them, hand the ball back to them. So I like I said before, I've been very fortunate because I've had some of these positive figures in my life. My Jungian therapist was a figure for me, or she has been this kind of figure for me. And, over the last few years, diving deep into the shadow, things have gotten a bit dark. And I'm pretty sure I've had like this dark night of the soul where things have gotten really painful with really dark emotions. And when there's that kind of suffering and that sort of discomfort, there's always this desperation that's been around me, haunting me. And I know that if I didn't have a positive teacher, I could have easily fallen in with a negative guru. I was really at a place where I was so desperate that I felt like my consciousness was for some reason quite open, and I could have believed anyone, but I was really, really fortunate to have great guides and teachers that constantly encouraged me to stay connected with my center, my integrity, my inner guidance, all throughout the uncertain and difficult times. And that's not to say that they didn't provide guidance and perspectives when I asked for them, but they always did so reluctantly, and always with the caveat that saying, like, how does this sound to you? If you did this, how would this feel for you? Yeah. So, yeah, and I just also want to emphasize that it's not negative for a teacher or guide to transmit knowledge or information, and it's not a negative thing to give students some sort of structure, practice, or framework to start with. And it's oftentimes very necessary to provide a safe sandbox for students to figure things out. What's key here is the attitude or approach or the dynamic between the teacher or the guru and the student. That to me is at the core of what I feel distinguishes between a positive and negative guru. Oh, and another thing, another common thread that I see with negative guru types is this claim that they know you better than you know yourself. I always kind of roll my eyes a little bit whenever I meet a person who somehow announces or claims that they have a really good read on people, that they know people better than they know themselves. And I just think that that's a very ignorant thing to say. I think sometimes an external person, a teacher, a guide, or a friend, or even a stranger, can sometimes read a situation that a person might be in better than the person themselves. But to claim that, another person knows you better than you know yourself, that's just too much. Just no. So I definitely see that sort of attitude, again, this kind of mistrust in other people, as a marker or an indicator of a negative guru. I would also say that in the more extreme cases, there's a lot of shadow projection and ego dominance at play with the negative guru. I would even speculate that perhaps deep insecurities and even an inability to manage their own inner turmoil is compensated for by trying to control others. Because sometimes how one treats others is often reminiscent of how one treats themselves internally. But this is big speculation, and this is a big generalization. So in reality, who knows what's really going on in the minds of these obvious and extreme negative gurus? So if you're questioning whether or not a teacher or a guide is positive or negative, I would suggest having a feel for where the power is. Is it in their hands or yours? Are they demanding that you give them your power? Or are they tending and caring to your own? Like a gardener who creates the best possible conditions for you to emerge and to blossom in the beautiful, vibrant, powerful, and unique expression that is you. I think actually the symbol of a gardener is a really great image of a good teacher. And again, that's not to dismiss teachers who at times are a bit more transmissive and even militant in their style. Again, it's about their attitude towards their students. Okay, so let's go on, because like I mentioned before, it's not just that we can fall victim by following a negative guru, but I also think we can easily become one, because if we think of the guru as an archetype, and archetypes can have a way of possessing and influencing and pulling the strings behind our behavior. So we can kind of become possessed by the negative guru archetype. And I have to admit that this has happened to me recently. I feel like I have been possessed by the negative guru. And how one gets possessed by the negative guru, I think that there are many ways. But one way that I think this happens is through actual profound transformation. So, like I mentioned before, I've been doing Jungian analysis for the past 2 years. And nothing that I have ever done has led to such profound transformations for the better. And I am excited about it. I got excited about it. When it first started happening, it made me want to step up on a soapbox and preach to the world, to the masses, that hear thee, I have found thy cure. I know the secret to alleviating all of your suffering. Gather ye round. I just wanted to go out in the world and just preach. It stemmed from true transformation for the better. It stemmed from deep healing. It stemmed from a feeling of wholeness. But what eventually happened is that after preaching on and on about this, some of my friends took me up on it and they gave it a try, and it offered some help, but it really didn't work out. It didn't result in a massive, amazing, life-changing experience. It wasn't as transformative for them as it was for me, and there was even a time, and I feel a little bit of shame to admit this, but it's true. There is a time when I did feel like I knew what was best for everyone, because I was able to figure out my own shit. So I had this weird confidence that I could figure out and that I knew what everyone else should do. I would think to myself, if only people would just do shadow work and confront themselves deeply and interpret their dreams and work with symbols, then they would be better. And because I discovered through therapy these new dimensions to myself and this new sense of wholeness and this new sense of home within myself, there was this weird phase where there was this sense of superiority came over me. And there was even a point where I felt that I was of a higher consciousness than others. Yeah, I kind of cringe at that now, but my point is that I can easily see how people can sometimes fall into this negative guru complex. For me, it stemmed from real change and transformation, and I just wanted to share it. Now I know, and I'm wiser, that not everyone is going to sort their shit out through things like dream symbols and imagination exercises. And I know now that there's a lot of people out there who just don't have the patience for the kind of therapy that I've been doing. And they don't have this connection or this resonance to these tools and this way and these methods of doing things. Of course, like, this isn't the only time that I've been bitten by the negative guru bug. Like, it has happened to me with trivial things, like when I quit coffee and I just simply felt better. I slept better and just felt better throughout my day. So I tried to convince others to do the same, and instead of offering them relief or joy, it actually just made a lot of people around me quite miserable. So, I mean, that's a trivial example, but... And it's also happened to me with things that are more serious and that come with great risk. So, for instance, when I first experimented with psychedelic substances, I've had profound and transformative and, come to Jesus experiences. Through psychedelic substances, I finally got in touch with my soul. And still to this day, the psychedelic experience is very important to me. And after my first few experiences, I was preaching pretty hard about psychedelics to my friends, and you can probably guess what happened. Many of them took them, and it either wasn't pleasant for them, or it didn't do much of anything for them. Now I am wiser, and I definitely would not openly recommend psychedelic substances, particularly after doing all of this work that I've done with Jungian therapy. I recognize that there is great potential with these substances, but there's also great risk. And it's important for individuals to do their own research and to not just bandwagon with peers. It ought to be approached with great integrity. And I know that it's kind of trending right now, so since we're on the subject, and I know everyone might be talking about it, and it's sort of gathered more headlines in our culture lately. If you want to hear one perspective, I would just say that these need to be respected and handled with great care, and to don't listen to any negative guru statements like, don't be afraid, that's just your ego talking, if you feel a little bit of anxiety about approaching psychedelics. Like I said, it's really important to approach psychedelics with a lot of self-integrity, and preferably with a qualified and reputable guide. It is normal to have some hesitations when it comes to playing or messing around with your own consciousness through substances. That is normal, but I just want to encourage you to stay connected to yourself when approaching these. Okay, so going back to topic, I do think it is possible that many negative gurus find their start in real and profound experiences like I did. And I think actually many negative gurus might actually be teaching things that have real value and offer great healing and transformation. Like, for example, if you look at the documentary with Bikram Yoga, the students loved what he was teaching. They may not have liked the dynamic between him as a teacher and them as a student, but there are still many people who practice it because they love what he taught. And what he taught offered people a lot of relief, and it was valuable. It gave them something. I also feel this way with Kundalini Yoga. So lately there's been a lot of controversy around Kundalini Yoga because the founder, Yogi Bhajan, has allegedly been a sexual predator with his students, and I'm inclined to believe that these allegations are true, and it's really, really, really unfortunate. It's unfortunate for the victims, and it's also unfortunate for the students, because I know in a situation like this, it gets very complicated because, again, you have a negative teacher who taught good things that has helped many, many people. It's really hard to reconcile that, to figure out what to do with that. So again, really complicated thing. But I think that sometimes a negative guru can get their starts just by inflation, I guess is the best way to describe it, where they teach good stuff, they see that it's offering real transformation to their students, and it gets to their head, and they kind of start feeling that they are somehow godlike. I mean, when this happened to me, when I kind of got bit by the negative guru bug and I got excited and I wanted to share everything, like there was definitely this hubris and an arrogance that took over. And there was like this twisted part of me that wanted my journey to be reflected in others. And I was, well, perhaps a bit of the wounded healer was in the mix as well, in that I wanted to fix others because it was easier to fix myself. I mean, that's not exactly the definition of a wounded healer, but there was some aspects of like perhaps working with other people was better than working with myself, or easier. So in this respect, like I can sympathize with how some well-meaning but misguided people can evolve into negative gurus, and I can see how this energy can kind of take over. And I don't know if all of these negative guru figures stem from good intentions. Some simply might be con artists looking to exploit people in need, or some people may just be so twisted up by their shadow and they're looking to control others because they can't control themselves. I don't know. I really don't know. So, I mean, there's not one type of negative guru. There's not one type of bad spiritual teacher. They can exist on a spectrum. Some can be just simply ignorant and misguided, and some can be downright malicious. But I do feel lucky, again, because not too long ago, I came to this deep and personal realization that everyone's path is very individual. And actually, to come into my power, I've had to own my own path and connect with it. I've had to walk my own journey, and it couldn't have been someone else's. And sure, my path can be supported by long existing traditions and structures, and I can have many wonderful guides along the way, but ultimately, what works for me is what works for me. And I think that's the same for you. That perhaps the only way for you to realize your power and who you are, you must first walk your journey. You have to walk your own spiritual path. And I think especially now, as things are evolving in our psyches, I think the spiritual path is going to look different for everyone. And not everyone is going to do this inner work like the way I have done through yoga and analysis and writing and dance and art. Everyone has their own way, and it's high time I start respecting it, because instead of pushing my way onto others, I would really rather watch in awe of people stepping into their own and claiming their own way. It's really a gift and a beautiful thing to behold when someone is in their authenticity. And yes, this is a very individualistic way to think about spirituality, but again, I think this is where things are going. All right, so getting close to the end here. I think one of the antidotes of getting possessed by a negative guru complex is to simply respect and trust that everyone is on their own path to maturation in their own way and in their own time. I think what we can do is listen more, and when we want to share, offering our experiences and stories with humility and understanding that they may be medicinal to others and they may not be, and that's okay. And this is definitely something that I'm going to try to commit to more as I grow more conscious of this force. So wrapping this all up, what do you think of all this? Do you think that I'm onto something? Do you think that there is a negative guru kind of energy that can wreak havoc in the shadows of our spiritual communities? And can you spot some negative guru influence either within you or around you? My hope is that if we agree that this is a problem, then perhaps our conscious awareness can, like a guru, like a real guru, dispel it from the dark. And I'll leave you with that. Until next time, take care.